Hi, I'm Doug Brash at Yale School of Medicine. This talks about the relation between abstract objects in biology and the tangible ones. I'll present specific examples that have changed my thinking, and I hope they maybe change yours. Now, some background might be helpful. I have a molecular biology lab that works out how sunlight causes skin cancer. But as a kid, I was interested in what space and time really are. So as an undergrad, I majored in physics. I built detectors for Fermilab's intermediate vector boson project and worked on the fusion power project at Livermore. But about halfway through, I ran into cyberneticist Heinz von Forster and his biological computer lab. And I became convinced that some of the questions I was interested in were really cognition problems involving the brain's internal representations, not perception, but cognition. So I minored in physiological psychology, and in grad school, I majored in theoretical biophysics. Quickly became convinced that you also needed to do experiments. So I noticed the molecular biologists, when they were done, could say what they had done and what they had discovered. So I learned how to do molecular biology, but continued an interest in apply these same kinds of criteria to these cognition-related questions, and I think that's relevant here. Let me start with what I was asked to address, the abstract forms and mathematical objects in biology and how they're causal. This is part of what I think the overarching question is for this group. Are there laws for biology? Where do they come from? And what do they operate on? Well, um, for an outline, we're going to talk about mathematical objects in science, then biological forms and how they tend to emulate the external world, which is kind of like kinematics in physics. It tells you what's there, but it doesn't tell you which movements are possible, just how to describe them. So this is a matter of what you call operands in mathematics. Then how do these forms get created? Then we switch to laws. So how do these guys get causal power? And that's now like what in physics would be dynamics. Okay, which motions can actually happen and what's controlling that? And in math, that corresponds to operators that are operating on the operands. And then a little more speculatively, well, how do you evolve forms that can actually do this, where you have an abstract object controlling a tangible object? So mathematical objects in science. So there's some really eerie relationships that you can see. So in math, Euler's identity, e to the I pi plus 1 equals 0. Say what? And in physics, there's the fine structure constant, which is the gap between the spectral lines of the hydrogen atom, in other words, the energy levels. And that involves the electric charge, pi, the permittivity, which is like the opposite of resistance, h bar, Planck's constant, and the speed of light. Like what? And how did these get there? Well, the physicists are worried about that. So a famous essay is by Eugene Wigner, who got the Nobel Prize for introducing group theory and symmetry into physics, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences. And he had a couple of comments. One is that coming from the mathematics side, he was a student of Hilbert. The concepts that the mathematicians putting in that weren't already in the axioms were chosen because they made ingenious logical operations that appeal to our aesthetic sense. And so it's not entirely objective. So it's some subset of what might be out there. And then the physicists come along, they find some behavior in the physical world that looks a little bit like some mathematics. And Wigner pointed out something I didn't know, which is that often the mathematics turns out to be much more powerful than it should have been. For example, Heisenberg used certain physical properties to deduce his matrix mechanics, physical properties of the hydrogen atom, but they don't actually apply to the helium atom, but the math does. So what? And because we don't understand why these things are useful, Wigner points out that we can't ever know whether we've got the correct mathematics, whether there's some other mathematics that might be out there. A little more progress comes from Max Born, who got the Nobel Prize for basically recognizing that Heisenberg's rules were matrix mechanics. matrix mathematics. And so he makes two observations. First is that math is depicting patterns independent of particular instantiations of it. And I think he's saying that those patterns arise from the definitions plus the axioms. And either he or I is concluding, I can't quite tell here, that then the patterns in physics arise because there are physical constraints that correspond to axioms over in the math world. And so that would be why it works. He makes another interesting observation, which is that any observation, physical observation that's objective, which means agreed upon by more than one observer, must be abstract symbols. And his epiphany came from realizing that what he thought was green, his brother might think was blue. You'll never know. So the only observations that can be objective are comparisons between physical states. Maybe he thinks the green turned to blue and his brother thinks what Bourne would have said was blue turned to green, but they can agree on the change. So then the result of the comparison must be a symbol, an abstract thing. There are not tangible comparisons out there. Now, comparisons, given that I've got a cybernetics background, are much more prevalent than people think about in science. So here's an example. If you want to study a mutation that causes some cancerous change in a protein, what are you actually doing? Well, here's a picture of DNA sequencing gels we used to do in the old days. And what are you doing? Well, to see one of those black bands, first you have to compare the black part with the surrounding white part. Once you've done that, you've identified a band. Once you've got the band, you want to know what the sequence is, so you've got to compare that band with the lane that it's in. Is it an A lane, a T lane, a G lane, or a C lane? And once you've done that, you want to know how far away it is from the beginning of the gel so that you know where in the sequence that band course, and that, in this case, say, take the first lane, the A, where did that come from? Well, it came after a T and before two other T's, okay? And you want to know if it's normal or a mutation. So you compare that to the sequence that's in your database of the normal DNA sequence of this gene. If you want to know whether it's an regulatory part of the gene or a structural part of the gene, you compare that to the amino acid codons that you know about from other people's work in this protein. And if you want to know whether, skipping on a little bit, if you want to know where the amino acid changes, then you have to compare the DNA sequence with the amino acid code to see what the amino acid change is with this new DNA sequence, if there was a change. And if you know if there's a functional impact, well, you have to compare the protein behavior with mutant with the wild type. So at every level, there's a comparison operation involved. And so we have access to that, thinking evolutionarily, because our body has homeostats regulating body temperature, glucose levels, and everything else. And so we have the key part of the homeostat, just like the thermostat. You have a sensor, but you also have a set point or some goal, and you have a comparison device that compares the two and detects whatever the difference is, and it sends that output signal somewhere to change the thermostat. Or more interestingly, if in a radar tracker, that output is used to change the position of the sensor, so it feeds back on itself. So there are all kinds of cool things you can do with homeostats. We have them in biology. And so I sort of think that Homo sapiens didn't evolve from chimpanzees, we evolved from homeostats. And that's how we can do these kinds of comparisons and thinking. Bit of a digression. Now, in the course of preparing the talk, I ran into a paper that predates both of these by Warren McCulloch, who's one of the founders of the idea of looking at neurons as neural nets, way ahead of his time. And so he points out, well, what's a universal? Getting back to the Plato question. Well, it's some invariant under some group of transformations. We'll come back to him in a little bit. Now, Plato's forms, as I understand them, were not really mathematical objects. So these timeless forms or abstract patterns are just there. They're sitting there, like a chair, or even the idea of good. There are no laws connecting them. Whereas mathematical objects are connected by mathematical operations. So Euler's identity I've written out here a little more explicitly, writing out what the operations are. There's an exponentiation operation, a multiplication operation, a addition, and an equality. So Plato's a little different from mathematics. Now, so what's actually going on, and what's the problem that we've been trying to solve here with Plato's forms and applying it to biology? Well, so over on the left, we have Plato's forms. For example, there's a chair, but as I said, it just sits there as this abstract idea. So there's no physics of chair, it just sits there. And then there's various instantiations you can have of it out in our real world. Now, in the paper by Hu et al., what they're looking at is AI vector embeddings, looking at, say, this particular chair in the real world. And the paper points out that, well, if you have a couple of these embeddings, they kind of converge on the same chair. So you can imagine, well, okay, is it like using the one AI is using X, Y, and Z coordinates, the other one is using R, theta, and phi, but you basically get back to the real world item. And if you're sophisticated enough, and if you combine several of these, you can deduce the real world instantiations. I point out that from the examples that were given in the talks, this approach also is able to talk about motions and changes in activities. So it's evidently also capturing operations, not just operands. And so in that sense, it's a little better off than Plato's forms. But this isn't really Plato. It's not the abstract things. So even though the paper calls them Platonic representations, I'm going to call them Platonish representation. And that sounds a little bit pejorative, but in fact, I think it's probably ultimately going to turn out to be more useful than the pure Plato's representation. Now, there are other ways you could be looking at this chair, two different people looking at it from two different views, or a frog can be looking at the chair. So there are different views that you could have of this reality. So I'm going to state here for later use something that I think is correct, but I need to know more. I hope people can tell me. And so the statement was that to pull this off, this deduction back to the real world representations from using the embeddings, find a vector embedding in which similarity equals pointwise mutual information. That feels to me a little bit like a generalization of this thing that biologists talk about, neurons that fire together, wire together. So if you function together, you get structure together. So stay tuned, and hopefully somebody can fill me in better on how to understand that. Now, before we get into the biology, I want to point out something about these Plato's forms, these universal Plato's forms. There are a couple points in this talk where I want to dislodge you from the preconceptions you may have coming in. First legacy worldview. These forms are universal. There is a classic paper that not enough people know about, which I think should have gotten a Nobel Prize, called What's the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain. The work was done by Jerry Letvin and Humberto Maturana. McCulloch, same guy I mentioned before, and Pitts are in this group, and they all agreed to be authors on all of each other's papers. But McCulloch is sort of like the father figure who gathered everybody together. Letvin and Maturana did the work. And what they did was single neuron recordings of a frog, of the nerves coming from a frog's eye. Okay, so this is before it gets to the brain. And they found only 4 kinds of outputs. There may be more now, I haven't looked, but you get the idea. They could see these neurons either detected contrast or convex objects or a moving edge or dimming. So that's great if you want to catch flies. And in fact, if a fly is not moving, the frog doesn't see it. So what does that tell us about universals? It tells us a few things, I think. One is, this looks to me like a cellular basis for Kant's categories, the entities or objects or concepts in which we're able to think in terms of. It's like a basis set or XYZ axis or an alphabet. This is what you make your thoughts up out of. But they're different for a frog than they are for us. So truth differs between species. The frog could say ours is unnecessarily complicated. And so these human forms of Plato's are not necessarily privileged basis vectors of truth, and they're actually anthropocentric. Now, what do we have in biology? Well, it's got abstract forms. So there's tangible ones, like the D.R.C. Thompson ones, where there's a mathematical relation describing that shape. There's the Drosophila body plan in the middle, which is the embryo is segmented. Those segments correspond to gene expression regions. Different genes corresponding to different segments in the homeobox gene cluster. We'll come back to that in a minute. And there's more abstract ones. The classic one is the genetic code. How A's, T's, G's, and C's tell you how to make a protein. Another one I like that is far too little known is a theorem about the efficiency of molecular machines. If you look at the efficiency of DNA binding proteins or visual pigment or ecosystems, they operate at what you can calculate as 69% efficiency. That turned out to be the thermodynamic limit for a bi-state machine, machines that have two states that have to be distinguishable. This is from Tom Schneider, same guy who developed DNA sequence motifs, if you're familiar with that. And it needs to be far better known than it is. Anyway, so there's lots of abstract and tangible patterns in biology. So if we look in the effector dimension, so we've got this gene cluster here, the Hox genes. There's a whole series of related genes. As I said, they're expressed in different regions of the embryo. Not only is there a spatial correlation to this pattern, there's a temporal one. The homeobox genes act along the developing embryo in the same sequence they occupy on the chromosome. So it's as if the genes are mimicking the external world or representing the external world. I say as if because, well, I'll get to this in a second. Because it could be mechanical, the genes are causing the other one. But there's a pattern here. So you have a micro level, which is sort of abstract, these genes, and you have the tangible level, the macro, which is the actual embryo. And so it's like these palanquins being carried around by the servants, and the prince is riding around inside. The actual work is being done at the micro level, and the patterns showing up at the prince level. And this is a format we're going to see again. Now, if you look at sensory representations, you don't have to worry so much about this mechanical embryogenesis issue. So here is sound. It's represented, called tonotopically. In other words, the frequencies are represented throughout your nervous system in the same order from low frequency to high frequency. So on the left, we have the cochlea unrolled. There's a membrane inside that vibrates. The sounds come in from the left. And the low frequencies are highest or have the strongest amplitude at the closest end, and the low frequencies have the largest amplitude at the far end. So the neurons connecting to the near end are representing high frequencies, and the ones connected to the far end are representing the low frequencies. Okay, that could be kind of mechanical, but you see the same pattern throughout. So if you look at the red arrow, so if you look at the nerve, well, you see in the brain, you've got several brain nuclei, which are where cell nuclei are that receive the dendrites. They work their way up eventually to the cortex, and as part of the cortex, it's the auditory cortex. If you look in the nerve, you'll see, as expected, each single nerve recording tends to respond to a particular sound. Okay. If you go up to one of the brain nuclei here, that's the cochlear nucleus, The spatial pattern across the nucleus is the same. It retains the relationship that you see from low frequencies to high frequencies. If you keep going up to the, what's called the geniculate nucleus, you see the same thing, except the spatial pattern is a spiral for reasons that I have no idea, but it's a contiguous pattern. And if you go up to the auditory cortex, you see the same thing. You see low frequencies represented in these neurons, the high frequencies up here. So there's a spatial representation in your brain and throughout your nervous system, this tonotopic, mimicking the external world in a sense. Touch is similar. Here's part of the brainstem. People would record from single neurons in the brainstem, and you can map which part of the body touch senses are being represented at which part of the brainstem, and you get a map of the animal. Oops. That's the brainstem. Same thing in the cerebellum, which is a surprise to me because I think of the cerebellum as being involved in motion. Thalamus is a real surprise because I don't think of it this way at all, but what do I know? But it's still spatially representing the external world. So that's somatotopic. Here's a rat, similar sort of thing. The blue arrows are pointing to somatic regions where you see kind of an outline of the rat. Over here is the motor area. So we're in the effector domain. What parts of the body get moved? It's also a map. Here's another way of presenting the same thing. You can ask, well, gee, why does the body do that? So it looks like you're having internal representations that are mapping the external world. What's the payoff? Well, there's a couple of payoffs for maps. You have you avoid having two representations in the same place, or one representation in two places. It also lets you know when your representation is complete without any gaps. And this is probably an important one, if there's an operation that has to be performed on this, the operands you're going to work on most likely are adjacent out in the real world. And so the operator is going to operate on adjacent neurons. You can worry about whether this is an intentional map or a result of something that embryogenesis has to do, but in the end result, it looks like a map. And I'll point out a subject near and dear to me. Language also uses an exotopic form, I would say. All you have to do is propose, and I can talk for an hour on this, and I have to this group. If you say that cognitive symbols are grounded symbols that resemble the referent out in the real world, and Harnad, as opposed to ones and zeros, for example, and Harnad has argued that this has to be the case for cognition. And if you say that language symbols are grounded by imitating the external world as humans see it, which 19th century linguistics before Chomsky, that's the way they looked at it. And that structure is entities with relations between them, like atoms joined by bonds, parts of a chair held together by bolts, not a two-part function argument structure. And that language puts grounded symbols into these triadic structures. If you do all that, you'll find out that natural language has a very simple structure that you can parse with an 8 megabyte program on my laptop. We'll come back to the parsing later, but I want to show you the structure because we're still just talking kinematics and forms. So the triadic structure. If you take a word string, like experts predict improvement, these are sentences just taken from databases that people use for this. And you'd say, okay, the meaning of that, people capitalize this, experts predict improvements. Okay, we'll put the entities in parentheses, the relationships in not parentheses. And so you have an entity, and a relation between them. We'll say that's a triadic format. It gets more interesting with more complicated things. So if you talk about the green grassland, what's going on here? Well, the basically is referring to the set of things I already told you about, or the things I assume you already know. And that set consists of green grassland. Green is essentially a property or component of grassland. And so if I use these symbols, so this is a known set composed of green and grassland, and grassland has one of its components green. And then I'll tell you that what happens is, if you look at it this way, English and other languages pervasively leave out these system component relations. So I'm going to abbreviate the one facing to the right as composed of, the one facing to the left as component of, and you see this everywhere. And so that's data compression, which is a concept linguists don't have, and I have been unable to convince them of. But you see it in many, many places. You sometimes leave out whole words. He met me there, or you mean he met me at there, et cetera, et cetera. You can look at this at your leisure. The horse raced past the barn fell is confusing because you left out the horse that was, and then intransitives, it fell by itself. So you've got this pattern here. If you adopt that pattern prior to data compression, then everything gets very regular. And if you assume that there's a regular thing, and if you assume there's a regular structure and that we're able to insert these things that aren't spoken, there's information coming that's not in the words that are on the page. So if we have this exogenous template or exogenous to the sentence, then we can just drop words into it. So you take a sentence which you and I have no trouble with. He saw the saw that I saw. Well, he is unambiguously an entity. So, gee, the saw that sense that I need must be the verb sense here. And then the is a word that carries with it this component of, because it's always followed by something. And then that something then must be the entity sense of saw, and so forth and so on. And so that simplifies word disambiguation. And there must be in your brain, I think, a track like this in some format. Then how this plays out, how it's used, we'll talk about when we talk about operations. Now, third point, how do biological forms get created? Well, some of them are inherited, like the Hox gene order you just got from your parents. The embryo segmentation is similar. The tonotopic representation of sound, well, in the cochlea is dictated by the anatomy. What's going on in the brain nuclei? Why that retains the somatotopic or tonotopic form is the question. And how does biology do it? Some of them are probably constructed, like somatotopic representation of touch. You can imagine constructing that from the infants with the infants experiment. And in fact, Sperry showed many years ago that you can cut optic nerve neurons, and they'll grow back to their correct location. This is in the frog. I think it might also be in the cat. I'm not sure. And so are they doing some fire together, wire together thing? I don't know. But you can imagine then a generalization of cells performing processes that occur together, differentiating together, and therefore giving you some coherent structure as a way of making these forms. And then some human forms evolved from others. There's a proposal in language that the hierarchical structure of language, you have words, phrases, sentences, subclauses, all that, derive essentially from hierarchical throwing movements. If you're going to throw something, you've got arm movements at a gross level, you've got finer movements here, and you've got movements on your fingers to release the ball. Now, a question I used to give as extra credit on final exams: where does biology keep the genetic code? There's a really abstract one. Okay. And for those of you who had this a long time ago, you get three bases in a row, and that specifies which amino acid is going to go into the protein. So the way it works is you have the RNA down here at the bottom with the sequence of bases. You have a transfer RNA, each one of which recognizes some particular sequence of 3 bases. And at the other end of the transfer RNA is an amino acid. and it gets spliced onto the end of the protein that you're making. So invariably, almost always, people would say, oh, the genetic code's sitting in the transfer RNA. Sorry, that's not the answer. It's sitting in the, somebody had to decide which amino acid wound up on which transfer RNA. So this enzyme, the aminoacyl tRNA synthase, which has, in this case, the methionines and the tRNA for methionine and an ATP to get them stuck together, that's where the genetic code is sitting. So it's the code's an abstract object. The aminoacyl tRNA synthase is a very tangible object, and it is, in some sense, holding the genetic code. So here again, we have this pattern. The work is being done by this abstract guy, this, the DNA sequence, and it's creating this tangible thing, this string of amino acids or a protein. It's also not so clear how abstract this is because those bases are real objects. And my biochemistry professor used to say a molecular biologist is someone who thinks that adenine is A. Actually, he told me that when he found out I was going to go work in a molecular biology lab. It was not intended as a compliment, although actually it's probably a very insightful description of molecular biology as it differs from biochemistry. Now, last point I'll make here is that there are restrictions on how to bridge the external world to internal representations. So Harnad, who I mentioned earlier, pointed out that cognition has to do some things. It's going to manipulate internal symbols. There are no chairs in your head, so you've only got symbols to work with. And he says that arbitrary symbols like 0 and 1 or Chomsky linguistics lack the information you need for cognition, because what you need for cognition is if you're going to discriminate by comparing two symbols. If you want to compare a duck and a horse, and all you've got is D-U-C-K and H-O-R-S-E, you cannot do the comparison. Similarly, for recognizing objects or categorizing them or generalizing them. And there you're comparing symbols for similarities rather than differences. So whereas grounded symbols like a pedestrian crossing sign have some physical correspondence to the referent. And so that allows for computations. And so Harnad would say that you have to have grounded symbols if you're going to be having internal computations. And remember that Max Born was saying that science is going to be involving abstract computations. Then the other point I would make is it came up partly with Markov blankets, but there's a little more to it. So going back further, and I think it's quoted in the papers, Ross Ashby, a cyberneticist who worked with Heinz von Forster actually, point out that if you have a tangible thing that you're regulating, if a thing is regulating something else, it has to have a model of that something. So to put it in biology terms, if a tangible biological thing is surviving by regulating its tangible external world, it must contain an abstract internal model of that external world. And then as I gather it from the discussions of Markov blankets, but don't totally understand, if all the information connecting external and internal domains can be divided into sensory transducer states that affect the internal state but not the external, and effector transducer states affect the external world but not vice versa, then the internal states will model the external behavioral probabilities, not the current status. In other words, it's saying it's not modeling the chair that you see sitting in front of you, is modeling the behavior of that chair, the causal things, if I'm understanding. And I would like to have somebody understand it. So there's some restrictions on what these abstract forms can be that are set by, the rock doesn't have these restrictions, but if you're going to do cognition or if you're going to try to manipulate your environment, there's some restrictions on what these abstract symbols can be. Now, can we give these abstract mathematical objects any causal power? So now we're talking about dynamics and operands. So first I want to point out, and this is again sort of like clarification or dealing with some predispositions. There's two kinds of laws. If we're looking for laws, you should be aware that there are two kinds. One is I'll call prescriptions, where the organism builds a structure or does an activity following a map. So here's a map of acetabularia on the left. Here's a picture of an acetabularia on the right. We're going to use the map on the left to build the one on the right. And if we're thinking about abstract forms controlling biology, it sort of makes us think this way. The other way that you can have a law, which is the way the physicists think about it, is you have some structure or activity, but it has to satisfy a criterion, usually in the form of C is constant, even if you let A and B change. So if something's moving, X and T can change, but the momentum's constant. So that's conservation of momentum. Or PV equals nRT. Well, P can change, V can change, N can change, T can change, but that equation's got to remain constant. And if we're thinking about abstract mathematical objects, maybe that nudges us towards this one. But we should need to be aware that there are a couple possibilities for what the law could be when we get to the end of this project of finding biological laws. Now, next, dislodging. This idea that patterns come from maps or goals. Well, here's one of my favorite examples for a few things called a Chladni plate from the 1700s. So you sprinkle some salt on a metal plate, you set it vibrating, in this case with like a violin bow, and you get this pattern. And so where did this pattern come from? There's clearly no map here. All you got is the sand grains, the metal plate, and this vibration. You can change the pattern, get a different shape, you get a different pattern. So what's setting the pattern are the constraints on these salt grains. Now, the salt grains are moving around by Newton's laws. But the thing, and if you do the same experiment tomorrow, you'll get the same pattern, but the particular salt grains that are moving in particular directions are going to be different. So at the micro level, it's a different behavior. And it's in a macro level, the behavior is the same. So what I can conclude is that Newton's laws will control the salt grains at the micro level, but they don't cause the pattern at the macro level. The pattern comes from constraints at the macro level. So Newton's laws are who's pushing who, but these patterns are not coming from that. They're coming from the constraints, like what you can't do. The edges aren't going to move, or the edges are, the plate ends here. And the vibration frequency. So to summarize, there are micro motions coming from Newton, but the macro direction or pattern is coming from constraints. Let me rephrase that. You've got non-directional motion going on at the micro level. The directionality comes at the macro level, and it comes from these constraints. That, I realized I was preparing this talk, is a Carnot heat engine, where you had fire, which is random direction, heat, and the piston, which imposes the directionality. This is a little more complicated because you've got a couple different micro inputs and a couple different macro constraints. So I'm going to call this a Chladni heat engine. And you can wonder whether, gee, this is going to be really important for biology. Let me make a comment here for the physicists. This issue of constraints, I think, is not thought about enough. And one of the reasons is history. The Schrödinger equation comes from Hamiltonians. Hamiltonians came from Lagrangians. You may remember that when you're taught to solve Lagrangians, you get Lagrangian multipliers, which are these little magic lambdas you throw in that help you solve differential equations. I found out a couple of years ago that those lambdas are actually the constraints. And this all comes from D'Alembert's principle, who was before Lagrange. Lagrange borrowed it, but took great pride in not showing any diagrams or explaining where all this all came from. So this has been taught as a calculational trick for 300 years. And even by 1840, Jacobi, as in Jacobian matrices, was teaching a course on this, and he was complaining about how it was all taught as a magical trick. But somewhere buried in there, and I don't totally understand D'Alembert's principle because I haven't found a good explanation of what he was thinking. It has to do with fictitious forces he's made up. Um, anyway, and that seems to be where these constraints come in. And there really needs to be a serious treatment of that, a serious and clear treatment. Now, laws. Let me give you two solved examples of, I think, how we could think about laws. So we've got these Chladni plates. So we got two of them. So we got particles and constraints number one, and get pattern number one. Particles and constraints number two, pattern number two. At the microtype level is the tangible stuff, and then there's this abstract pattern up here at the macrotype. The microtype and macrotype are words I made up, corresponds to genotype and phenotype in biology. We would like to think of causal rules going from pattern one to pattern two. But actually, the causality, as I mentioned, is going on down at the micro level. The particles are bumping into each other. There are constraints on them. And each of these lower levels, there is another, the blue arrow is kind of a physical event causality. There's sort of a structural causality, these red arrows, about how the particles and constraints lead to the pattern and how pattern two comes about the same way. And so again, what we're seeing here is the business end is going on at the micro level, and you get these patterns and abstractions up at the level of the princes being carried around. Now, we like to think about causality between one and two. Oh, right, sorry. Before I get to that, let me give you another example, Noether's theorem, which is the conservation laws like conservation of momentum and energy result from symmetries in translation or rotation through space or time. So that space and time don't have boulders, whirlpools, or tunnels. And so again, you have a particle and a symmetry at some lower level, and then a law at the higher level. So tangible leading to the abstraction, same sort of palanquin and prince thing. Now, what about the causality up here? Well, we like to think in terms of causality one and two, and we're rather good at making up stuff for this kind of causality. So let me ask you, when you pour milk into a glass, is your gut feeling that you're pushing the milk into the glass, or is your gut feeling that you're pulling the pitcher out from underneath a puddle of milk and it's falling towards the floor? Probably not. So we're rather good at making up stuff like this. And this is sort of a Daniel Dennett sort of thing. But in any event, so it looks to me like there's a possibility that causality has this structure rather than the pattern one arrow, pattern two causality, particularly in hierarchical systems like you see in biology. Now, how do you get these causal events from abstract things? So let me give you some more examples. So we talked about the frog being able to see edges. Well, how can you do that? Well, it's actually rather easy. The algorithm is, if you have a photoreceptor up here where it says photocells, if it excites its own neuron, but inhibits the two on either side of it, that is going to give you a signal at the left from the neuron just to the left of the edge and the one just to the right of the edge. So it's a very simple algorithm. It's not a map, but it does give you this abstract format of an edge. Give you another one. This one I really like. This is wasp nests. So wasps do not have a map of a wasp nest in their head. The brains aren't big enough. What they do is they have an algorithm. They land on a nest, a partly built nest. And if they see pattern P, they spit here. If they see pattern Q, they spit there. The net sum of all that, with many wasps and many spittings, is a wasp nest. And different species do it differently. So over on the left, the dark boxes, the dark cells are the initial ones, and the light ones are the ones that got built around the initial ones. And so the rules for where you spit depend on the species. It turns out, I didn't realize this until I was preparing this lecture, there's a term for that. It's called stigmergy. And so you could see this as a third kind of law that's neither the pattern nor a criterion of constancy. It's sort of an algorithm of micromotion plus external constraints, a lot like the Chladni plate. And you can sort of imagine embryos doing something like the wasp are doing here. So it's the same pattern. So at the micro level, you have if-then rules and some perception in the wasp perception of the state of the nest, and that makes the nest state 2 because he spit somewhere. And then somebody else comes along, sees nest state 2, spits, and now you get nest state 3. And so again, except here it's the other direction. The abstract thing, the if-then rule, is down on the micro level, and the tangible thing, the nest, is up on the macro level. But same thing, this dual two-layer structure. Now, another thing I want that hardly anybody knows about, but we should all know about in our thinking, is Abler's particulate principle. He was a paleontologist at the Museum of Natural History in Chicago, and he was thinking about evolution, I think. Anyway, there's two kinds of operations if you're going to have A and B and do some operation on them. There's blending, so you get some pink stuff and some white stuff. You get some red stuff. Oh, I messed up. That left one should be probably red. It would be clearer. Anyway, red and white give you pink. Okay. And any sample of that is going to be a lighter pink. So paint works that way, geology works that way, weather works that way. You can't go back. You can't go back to red plus white. And so if you keep doing this, it trends to the population average. And one of the only reason that Darwin favored Lamarckian evolution at all was he didn't know about this particulate principle, and he thought that everything had to be blending, and you could not understand why everybody didn't evolve to some average height. The explanation is the particulate principle. So a sample, you can combine it, you get reds and whites, and you're still reds and whites. And chemistry works this way, and genetics works this way. So you retain your initial building blocks. You can, if you want, retrieve the prior state. And however, you can create new levels of organization this way. You can create phenotypes outside the initial range. You can get people who are taller than either of their parents. And so Abler called that self-diversifying. And what it relies on is this evaluation step here, some macro level operation, because inside that pink box, there's still red paint and white paint, just individual molecules of it. So it's again a macro level operation. And so same sort of thing, this two-level structure, but there's two ways of doing it. And clearly the particular way of doing it is more powerful. In language, I would just say that, well, okay, we'll say the hierarchies are also entity relation entity, otherwise you're going to lose the groundedness. And so I will, for interest of time, I will just tell you that what happens is you build things up. You're coming along the way I said, and you insert these relations, and now you decide to build a network into a thing, and then you're later then you can build a network of highways into a thing, and then you build that whole thing into build a network of highways to blah, 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 blah. And then what it turns out, again, this is this 8 megabyte program. Well, it's actually 4 megabyte program, 4 megabyte dictionary. Um, it turns out that this works because these relation um, symbols have properties of buildings. So they're actually also operators. And you can imagine it could be quite complicated to decide how to build this stuff. And it turns out that all you have to have is a operator precedence hierarchy of who's above who in this hierarchy. And that tells you how to build this. And it all goes boom, 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 boom. So, for example, here's one. The man who knew Aaron knew, the man who Aaron knew Clive called. There's two interpretations of that sentence. The man who Aaron knew, that person, knew Clive called. The man who Aaron knew Clive called. And this simple program figured that out. And it's also figured out who's doing what to who. So this isn't pretty print. I find it's clearer. Um, so here somebody knew something, and then the man was a component of who Aaron knew, and so forth and so on. And you see it up here. The man knew something, Clive called somebody, Aaron knew the man. So it's easy to figure out who's doing what to who. And you can even do Chomsky transformational grammar this way. Once you put in these little composed of things, you can also, amazingly, I think, treat this as algebra, because really what this is saying is that the cat goes into that, and that goes into this empty parenthesis here is the thing the dog is chasing. And there are rules for that, which are basically like C command in grammar. And the last thing I point out here, so my point here is that here's some abstract stuff, which is again having causal power. And the word symbols in this algorithm become grounded if you now start training large language models on visual and robotic data, which means that it can now do Harnad's cognition operations, which I would have second thoughts about. Now, start to head into a little bit of speculation. Why are there any regularities in the world? Because the world has rules? Well, that just postpones the problem. What I would point out is that things that are similar, undergoing similar interactions, and don't have any other reason for the outcome to differ, they're going to be the same. So it's not like you're forcing something to be the same. You're just saying there's no reason to be distracted from what you would naturally do, which is rather like what Noether's theorem is saying about mechanical objects moving. But this absence of diversion seems a little more susceptible to being guided by abstract forms than forcing things does. And this resembles something else that people ought to be more aware of than they are probably, is Richard Levin's idea that evolution comes not because you're adding a whole bunch of stuff onto what you're doing, but by getting rid of a lot of stuff so that you're not, instead of doing a lot of things badly, the part of biology does one things well, because they've got fewer degrees of freedom. So last point, how to evolve this kind of structure. Well, here's the structure I've been showing you. How do you evolve something like that? So these tangible, abstract palanquin Prince units, and I've shown you they appear at all levels in biology. I would point out that, gee, wouldn't it be great if evolution just handed you two-level structures like this, these modules, sort of like structure function modules that evolution had to choose from, rather than evolving a bunch of micro events, evolving a bunch of phenotypic expressions of micro events, evolving or finding amongst all of that some of the macro level functional events that will get along with somebody else's macro event that happen to evolve at the same time in the same place. It seems, highly improbable. Wouldn't it be great if we had, if nature handed us these little modules like that? So if wishes were fishes, but yet, first of all, Legos always make something. There's something about the structure of Legos. Doesn't matter what you do. It may be a boring little bridge or something, or a staircase to nowhere, but they always make something. And biology has units like that. There's the 4 DNA bases that recombine in a particulate way. Each 3 base combination combines in a particular way to specify an amino acid. There's 20 amino acids. Each of them has a chemical side chain with a particular chemical property. Homeotic mutants in Drosophila hot genes rearrange segments, and they can put the fly's antenna in the middle of his body and just scramble it. And embryogenesis really only has about 5 or 6 morphogenetic movements. The placodes can thicken, or you get a folding, or you get a ball or a tube where the cells disperse. That's it. And you just recombine those and you get an embryo. So those are particulate operands amenable to recombination as these 2-level palanquin operations. And so the Lego hypothesis, if you build it, it will be something. Biology works because at every level it consists of 2-level units made of palanquin and a prince. And then in smaller print is everything I told you. And then we go into speculations. So Legos, if you did that and you had the stigmergy, this algorithm, that's a way to get stuff done. You could turn that into a law if there was actually some constraint on it. Then it starts to look like an invariance law. And now I'll end on a speculation that you just need to specify how to make these Legos. And if, like Levins is right, what you're doing is putting constraints on something else to reduce the degrees of freedom, then all you got to do is block some other Lego. And I've got some comments on how you could design that. Like you may know that fluffy feathers that were just insulation became flight feathers allowing flight when the little knobs on the feathers became hooks, and now suddenly the feathers can get linked together and poof, you got feathers and you got flight. So where could this information be coming from to design such Legos? I don't know, but 2 things I've heard over the talks make me think that there might be a stipulation that would then make this into a law. So this Ashby's blanket thing, if an organism survives by regulating its environment using sensors and effectors, then it has to build an abstract internal model of the external's probabilistic behavior. So that's the 2 halves of our 2-level thing. And then the Platonish theorem, like how to encode this information. The convergence between abstract and tangible is facilitated by emulation vectors for which the similarity of embedding, in other words, our abstract model, equals pointwise mutual information, which I think applies to the external tangible object. So my gut is that this has all the information in it, it's just a matter of pulling it off. I'm unable to do it because I don't yet understand the proofs and implications, but maybe the group can pull this off and you wind up with an invariance law, taking a criterion that's met, tells us how to make these little Legos that can then buy us all these design things. So the key takeaways are that Plato's forms are anthropocentric, Kant's categories are species specific. There are 3 kinds of biology laws that you would think, these maps, these invariants, or these stigmergic algorithms. Patterns don't have to use maps or goals. There might be a mathematics of heat engines in here. The apparent causality can result from the physical causality between the micro events and a structural causality that's going up and down between micro and macro, but not between the macros. And the way you get a macro is by coordinating the constraints. In other words, those metal plates, they have a shape. You go around the whole periphery and it's contiguous. Science requires comparisons and therefore abstract objects. That's Max Born's observation. It's not all that obvious which patterns are abstract and which were imposed by the researcher. So is a DNA sequence abstract, or is it the adenines and thymines and so forth? And then biology has many examples of these. And these abstract objects in biology often emulate the external world. So there's some payoff, some constraint for doing that. And then these restrictions on being an organism that's regulating its environment versus being a rock, may dictate the existence of these two-level tangible abstract building blocks, these palanquin Lego blocks. And you might get a law for that out of the Ashby's blanket and Platonish theorems. So thank you very much. I hope this is something you folks enjoy thinking about and maybe come up with a solution. Take care.